Welcome to Issues and Insiders. I'm Mitch Kokai, the Senior Political Analyst for the John Locke Foundation. And today we're talking about the recent case of a federal judge in Raleigh issuing a major order against the Syrian government. He ordered Syria to pay more than $1 billion in damages connected to terrorist attacks from 2015 to 2017. Why is this a case that came before a federal judge in Raleigh? Well, our next guest is here to provide some of the answers to that question. Kieran Shanahan is an attorney based in Raleigh, and he helped represent plaintiffs in this case. So first of all, we want to know, people who are hearing about this case might think this is something that should go in front of some sort of international court. Why is this something that goes through the U.S. court system?
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for having me, Mitch. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you. The federal government, in its wisdom over time, when we realized and began to learn that there were these states, governments, if you will, countries that were sponsoring terrorism against American citizens, sponsored an act which allows for the bringing of lawsuits against terrorist states in the United States.
And this is the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act.
Thank you, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And there's also sort of a companion to that says once you can get jurisdiction in the United States, have your trial here in the United States, and then you can seek damages after you get that here in the United States. Because the government, in addition to, there are consequences to being declared a foreign adversary state, and that includes having your assets seized. So the government and private individuals are constantly finding, locating, and seizing assets that ultimately go into the pot upon which victims can recover.
And the plaintiffs in your case are either families of people who were killed in terrorist attacks, or in some cases, people who survived terrorist attacks. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's correct. And of course, obviously, the half a dozen that actually were killed in the terrorist attack. So interestingly, I think it's sad in a way as terrorism and violence has proliferated throughout the world, that we try and find ways to respond. The example I'm referring to is when the terrorist attack of 9/11 occurred. The main fund that was set up was only for those who died. And then people started realizing, well, wait a minute, what about the families and the pain and the suffering that they go through? And so when this law was passed, it was extended to spouses, children, parents, and the like. So therefore, unlike the initial victims of 9/11, were only those who were injured or killed in those murderous attacks could receive recovery. So the statute and the framework is really well thought out by people that came long before me. I just was, on behalf of Jim Kane and his daughter, our lead plaintiffs in the case, that we could use the framework to bring justice for these victims here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So interesting.
And in that case, that was Jim Kane's daughter, Cameron. Her husband died in the terrorist attack in Brussels, and there were other cases, I believe, in Paris.
In Istanbul. Yes. And
Jerusalem even?
Yes, and the fourth was Jerusalem. The one in Belgium was at the airport, and he was with his sister. And so it was very, very sad. They were actually flying back to the United States to attend a family wedding. And Jim Kane and his daughter, they actually flew over to Belgium because they couldn't find him. They hadn't gotten a report of him. And they were here a short while before it was determined that he had been killed in the explosion.
Now, from my understanding, all of the cases here involved attacks by ISIS. The lawsuit is against Syria. What's the connection?
Yeah, so ISIS and Al-Qaeda were sponsored by Syria. And that was the main burden of proof that we had in the case. And we were able to show that they were housing the terrorists, they were allowing transit in the terrorists. But one of the interesting parts of this case is that Syria had about 1,500 people in their prisons, I mean the worst of the worst, and said, look, do you want to stay in prison or do you want to become a jihadist? And they became, the frontline folks who were carrying out these terrorist attacks. And so we were able to demonstrate through expert testimony and through various ways that Syria was not only sponsoring but was behind helping orchestrate and carry out these attacks. Probably the most significant thing is that, if you remember, we were limiting oil. So Syria was willing to allow ISIS to be funded. They would go and take over an oil field, sell them sell the oil illegally and raise substantial sums of money that funded their terrorist activity. And all that was with the aid and comfort, if you will, we'd probably say in the U.S., aiding and abetting, co-conspirator. They were shoulder to shoulder partnership with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all those bad actors that we know so much about, unfortunately.
To go through a legal process like this, it requires the plaintiffs to really have to relive some terrible things. Why would they do that?
I think a lot of the surviving victims, of course, have had psychological, assistance and counseling, and sometimes I think we know that talking about things can be therapeutic. Even if they just had a judgment and never collected a nickel, there was a great sense of justice and relief, and it was great to talk to some of these plaintiffs afterwards, and they were so thankful, and they were thankful to Judge Boyle, who took an active interest in the case and ensured, of course, that we dotted our I's and crossed our T's, so there'd be no question. But there is a modicum of relief, I think, to people who get the chance to tell their story, and I think we did it in a very respectful way by using affidavits rather than having live testimony, and the judge allowed for that. And so I think that there is a sense of closure and begin to move on. There are some of these victims, they don't want to leave their houses. It's really, really sad. And we hear about terrible things that happen a far place away, whether it's someone a victim of a storm or another terrorist attack, and we go, boy, that's terrible, and then we move on about our days. These victims, family members, survivors, they don't really move on. They just have to get on with life and have to deal with it. So I think, as a lawyer, it was one of my proudest moments to get justice for them.
You mentioned Judge Terrence Boyle in this case. His award and this judgment, more than $1 billion if you put the compensatory and the punitive damages together. What did you think about the size of that award? Was that something that was surprising?
No, not really. There was a case, and again, as often happens in the law, is that once somebody has gone down the trail, and usually the first mover, and especially with federal court, you get usually really good judges, thoughtful. There is a construct that sort of provided a framework out of the D.C. Circuit, and we followed that construct. And the judge was satisfied, and so he usually gives sort of if you're a spouse, you're kind of in a certain range, or if you're a parent, maybe a different range, and if you had close relationships. So there's a lot of, tinkering, if you will, to try and find a number. There's no number that's going to really bring their loved ones back, and that's going to stop the suffering, but maybe it'll help a little bit. So, we were very pleased that Judge Boyle was appropriately indignant in his number. I guess this is a nice way of saying it. He certainly grasped how terrible this is. I mean, it's one of the most wanton things you can do. The reason terrorists do what they do is that they want to undermine your sense of well-being, and it's just hard to get that back.
In addition to the money, the words coming from the judge in the document that was filed, he said that Syria deserves unadorned condemnation. He talks about moral depravity that knows no bounds, and he contrasted the Syrian government with the plaintiffs, calling them courageous and talking about their patient determination. You had to like the fact that the judge adopted those words.
He did, and again, he was very active in the case. He had a lot of great questions. He asked for status conferences. He wanted to make sure we were moving things along. I mean, I think we had over 20 different experts. And we had to take foreign law that was applied here, and so we used experts to help do that. And of course, other precedent was helpful. It was a complex presentation, all things considered, and Judge Boyle was as versed in it as humanly possible, I believe.
I mentioned to several people about the outcome of this case and said $1 billion awarded to these plaintiffs against Syria. The reaction was almost universal. First they'd say, wow, that's a lot of money. And then second, they would say, they're never going to get any of this money. Can they ever collect any of this money, and how?
Yes, and so the good news is that constantly both the government and private people are looking for assets. But the federal government has set up a fund when assets are seized from Syrian operations, whether they're legal or illegal, they're taking their money and they're putting it into this fund. So all of these plaintiffs can take their awards now, their judgments, and apply to the fund. And the fund traditionally makes distributions on an annual basis. It's not been a huge sum, but it's not insignificant. However, just recently, when we raised the debt ceiling, $1 billion of the trillions of unspent money from COVID have now been allocated to that fund. And we've just learning now that those monies should be available in the calendar year of 2024 for distribution. So when we started, I would have agreed with those people who told you good luck collecting it, but that wasn't the point of doing it. That was never the point of doing it. I'll say that. On the other hand, it was serendipitous and a bit of smile on people's faces to know that, hey, there might actually be some money that comes from it. But it'll never undo the damage that's been done in their lives, but it's certainly better than nothing, right?
Whether they were going to collect money or not, what does a judgment like this do in terms of sending a message to Syria or any other government that wanted to be a part of terrorism?
Well, I think that it actually is, it sends a strong signal that we're united against this out-of-the-box, inhumane, barbaric murdering that goes on by these rogue states that are funding, terrorist groups. When it really makes a difference is that, if other countries, and many do, stand shoulder to shoulder with us in condemning this sort of aberrant behavior, then sometimes a country like Syria says, maybe we made a mistake. We want back in Gaddafi, right? And so, Gaddafi paid billions of dollars in addition to doing other things to help restore his status. And so hopefully, all you can do is stand for justice, bring light to darkness, and believe that in the long run, good will win out. And so I think in this total construct, not only the people that came before me, but the legislation that was passed that created this vehicle for some modicum of justice for these victims, I think will pay dividends in the future, and other people will hopefully benefit from it as well.
Well, it's certainly a major award and deserving of a lot of recognition. Kieran Shanahan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.